Look at this axolotl. In 1863, France invaded Mexico. The invasion failed, but before it collapsed, 34 of these were pulled out of a lake on the edge of Mexico City, packed into containers and shipped to Paris. Nobody was rescuing anything. They were spoils of war. 6 of them, 5 males and 1 female, were handed to a French zoologist. Within 4 years, they were 10,000. Today, there are millions of axolotls on this planet, in bedrooms and classrooms and laboratories on every continent. And in the lake they were taken from, there may be 50 left. I'll show you exactly how that theft happened, and why it's the reason this animal still exists. Welcome to Reptile Mind, and this is how your axolotl was stolen from Mexico.
Before any of this, there was a valley full of water. The Central Valley of Mexico sits at around 2,240 meters above sea level, and it once held a connected system of high-altitude lakes, Texcoco, Zumpango, Chalco, and Xochimilco. Cold, still, spring-fed water. That was the entire world of this animal. It has never lived anywhere else on Earth naturally, not one population anywhere ever. The people living there had a name for it. Axolotl comes from Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, and it connects to Xolotl, a god associated with lightning, with death, and with transformation. Which is a strangely precise thing to name an animal that refuses to transform. We'll come back to that.
And here's the part that surprises people. The place this animal now survives in is not natural. Xochimilco has been managed by humans for more than 1,500 years. During the Aztec Empire, the wetland was reshaped into a grid of canals surrounding rectangular artificial islands called chinampas, floating farm plots built for intensive food production. So the last refuge of a wild species is a 1,000-year-old agricultural system. The axolotl's home is a human invention.
Now, why would anyone ship these to Paris? Because this animal breaks a rule. Every salamander starts life in water as a larva with feathery external gills. Then it metamorphosizes. It absorbs the gills, develops lungs, climbs out, and spends the rest of its life on land. That's the deal. That's what being a salamander means. The axolotl doesn't do it. It stays in the water. It keeps the gills. It grows to full adult size, becomes sexually mature, and breeds, while still, technically, a larva. The scientific term is neoteny, or petamorphosis. It is an animal that never grows up, and reproduces anyway. To a 19th century European naturalist, that was close to impossible. Larvae don't breed. That's not how any of this works.
And then it got stranger. Decades later, Willem Lofberger and later Julian Huxley took axolotls and dosed them with thyroid hormone. The animals metamorphosed. They absorbed their gills, they developed lungs, they climbed out of the water. There is a land-dwelling adult salamander hidden inside every axolotl, and it simply never arrives, unless you force it. The forced version tends to be less healthy and shorter-lived, which is its own answer to the question of whether it should be done.
If you want the real history behind the animals people keep and not the pet shop version, subscribe. That's the whole channel. The first specimens reached Europe around 1803 when Alexander von Humboldt sent preserved animals back from Mexico City. They caused interest, but preserved animals in jars don't breed, and Europe wanted living ones. Then politics did what curiosity couldn't. In the 1860s, Imperial France invaded Mexico. It was a short, expensive, failed adventure in colonization, and while it lasted, French scientific institutions used the opportunity to extract things. On the 22nd of January, 1864, at a session of the Imperial Zoological Society in Paris, a report was delivered on new acquisitions. Among them were 34 axolotls. The historian who documented this describes them plainly as a living harvest of the occupation. 33 of them were dark. 1 was white.
That white animal matters more than anyone knew at the time. It was the first recorded leucistic axolotl, and if you have ever seen a pale pink axolotl with dark eyes, which is the image most people picture when they hear the word, you are looking at that one animal's legacy. The shipment was split between 2 Paris institutions, and 6 animals, 5 males and 1 female, went to a French zoologist named Auguste Dumaril. Everything that follows comes from those 6. One historian put it about as well as it can be put. If that ship had sunk on the way from Mexico to France, the axolotl might never have become known beyond the edges of its home pond.
Dumaril started breeding them, and they bred extraordinarily well. Within 4 years, that population had produced roughly 10,000 animals. Hundreds had already been sent out across Europe, traded, gifted, passed between institutions and enthusiasts. Understand why that mattered scientifically. In the 1860s, if you wanted to study animal development, you were dependent on whatever you could catch in whatever season it happened to breed. Your research ran on the animal's timetable. Axolotls didn't care. They bred in captivity, year-round, on demand, in a tank. A female lays somewhere between 300 and 1,000 eggs at a time. You could have embryos whenever you needed embryos.
That turned this animal into one of the first standardized laboratory organisms in the world, and because the surplus had to go somewhere, axolotls started appearing in private aquariums, in zoos, in the homes of people who simply thought they looked extraordinary. By the end of the 19th century, an animal from one wetland on the edge of Mexico City was living in living rooms across an entire continent. In 1935, some of those animals traveled again, from a Polish laboratory to the University of Buffalo in New York. The scientists there did something that changed what a pet axolotl actually is. Concerned about the gene pool, they brought in wild-caught axolotls to widen it, and at one point, they crossed in a different species entirely, the tiger salamander, Ambystoma tigrinum, the axolotl's close relative. That cross is where several of the popular color varieties come from, including the albino lines.
Which means a lot of the axolotls in the pet trade today are not purely Ambystoma mexicanum. There is tiger salamander in the mix. Most owners have never been told this. The buffalo colony eventually moved to the University of Kentucky, which today holds what is described as the deepest pedigree of any laboratory animal on Earth, an unbroken breeding record running back to that Paris shipment. But breeding convenience isn't why the laboratories kept them. Cut off an axolotl's leg and it grows a new one. Not scar tissue, a complete functional limb, bone, muscle, nerves, blood vessels in the right proportions, doing the right job. And it will do it again if you do it again.
The mechanism is stranger than the fact. Within hours, the wound seals over. Within a day or two, that skin thickens into a structure that starts sending chemical instructions down into the tissue below. And the cells underneath do something that isn't supposed to be possible. Mature muscle cells, cartilage cells, connective tissue cells, cells that decided what they were years ago, loosen their identities and start behaving like stem cells again. They pile into a mound called a blastema, and from that mound, the limb rebuilds itself. And those cells remember where they are. Researchers tested it by taking the blastema from an amputated limb and transplanting it somewhere else entirely on the body. It grew a limb anyway. It isn't just legs either. Tail, gills, sections of spinal cord, parts of the heart, portions of the brain. And it heals without scarring at all.
So the obvious question is why we haven't simply read the instructions. Because for most of those 160 years, we couldn't. Salamander genomes are enormous, vastly larger than ours, and for decades that put the axolotl's genetic code beyond what sequencing technology could handle. One of the most intensively studied animals in the history of biology, in laboratories on every continent since the 1860s, and nobody could read its genome. It was finally sequenced in 2018 and published in Nature. Sit with that for a moment. This animal was answering questions about regeneration before Darwin published. It was in classrooms before the invention of the aeroplane. And we only got its instruction manual 8 years ago.
That's the real reason the axolotl matters to people who have never owned one. Somewhere in that enormous genome is an answer to a question about us. Why does a human being heal with a scar when a distant relative sitting in a tank doesn't have to? We still don't know, but we can finally look. Now, the price. You cannot found a global population on 6 animals without consequences, and the consequences showed up early. By 1880, the naturalist Hans Gatto was already writing that whole colonies of axolotls were dying out or turning sickly, and that healthy breeding pairs had become difficult to find. That was 140 years ago. It has not improved. The main research colony today runs at an average inbreeding coefficient of around 35%. For context, in conservation breeding, anything above 12.5% is treated as an emergency requiring intervention. This population sits at nearly 3 times that.
Geneticists measure the diversity left in a population as founder genome equivalents, essentially how many genuinely distinct founding animals worth of variation remains. In that colony, the figure is under 6. 6 animals went to Dumeril in 1864. 160 years later, the genetic diversity is still functionally 6 animals. So the theft preserved this species. It also permanently damaged it. Both of those things are true. And while all that was happening in Europe and America, this is what was happening in Xochimilco. In 1998, surveys found around 6,000 axolotls per square kilometer. By 2008, 100. By 2014, 36.
One survey covering 11 separate sites across the region found a single animal in the entire study area. Current estimates from the IUCN put the wild population somewhere between 50 and 1,000 individuals, and it is listed as critically endangered.
Now, this is the part I want to be straight with you about, because the story is more comfortable if you blame the French, and that would be wrong. The theft is not why the axolotl is disappearing. Mexico City is. The lake system was drained across centuries to make room for a growing city. What survived got polluted. Non-native carp and tilapia were introduced and ate the eggs and larvae. Animals were collected for food and for traditional medicine. The valley that once held 4 connected lakes now holds one set of canals on the edge of a metropolis of 20 million people. France took 34 animals. We took the water.
And then in June 2021, something happened that nobody planned. Minecraft added axolotls. They spawn in caves, they attack fish, and they come in 5 colors, including a pale pink one, which the game calls leucistic. The same word and the same trait that traces back to that single white animal in a Paris shipment in 1864. Mojang was explicit about why they did it. They added axolotls the same way they'd added bees, to draw attention to an endangered species. So an animal that was nearly gone from the only lake it has ever lived in became more or less overnight one of the most recognizable creatures on Earth to an entire generation of children.
Which brings us to something genuinely hopeful. In 2025, researchers took 18 captive-bred axolotls and released them into Xochimilco, some into restored chinampas, some into an artificial wetland nearby. They tracked every animal with radio telemetry. All 18 survived the monitoring period. They moved. They established home ranges. They fed successfully. That sounds modest. It isn't. Reintroducing captive-bred animals to the wild usually goes badly. The mortality is normally severe because animals raised in tanks don't know how to be wild animals. 18 out of 18 is a genuinely significant result, and the lead researcher said as much. International trade in wild axolotls has been restricted since 1975. Every axolotl legally sold anywhere in the world is captive-bred. Nobody is taking these out of the lake for your tank.
So here's where it lands. 34 animals were taken out of a Mexican lake as a trophy of an invasion that failed. 6 of them founded a species' entire future in captivity. That act was not conservation, it was extraction, and it left the captive population with a genetic problem it will never fully escape. And it is also, almost certainly, the reason this animal still exists. Because the lake emptied, and when it did, there were millions of axolotls in tanks all over the world, descended from those 6. And some of their descendants are now swimming in Xochimilco again. Your axolotl is a survivor of a theft and a hedge against an extinction, and neither of those was anybody's plan. If you've got one, tell me in the comments what color it is. And now, you know where that color came from. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.